everybody, it's Sarah, and today I kind of have a review 2.0 for you, because if you remember, then you will know that last year I started a little series called A Chorus of Dragons, written by the author Jen Lyons. And you will also know that I did a full series review last year. However, that full series review wasn't really a proper full series review because obviously the last book in that series was not yet published. However, it was published about a month ago and I have now read all 5 books in the series, and so I thought I'd do a little revised spoiler-free series review for a series that has now become one of my all-time favorites. Another reason why I wanted to redo the review is because I did reread the first 4 books in the series before I read the 5th book, and while I still have a lot of the same opinions as I had in that first review, which by the way, I will leave the review link down below and up there so you can check out how my opinions exactly changed. But while I still have a lot of the same opinions, some of them changed slightly, and I also just think I have a better grasp now after reading the first 4 books of what the series does really well, what the series doesn't do so well, because there are some things, and I just have a better way of, I don't know, I guess sharing my thoughts after this reread, because this definitely is one of those series where, you know, you just understand it better after a reread. So as I said, this review will be spoiler-free, although I will probably within the next few weeks have a spoiler-free discussion review up of the 5th book, a dedicated review. And as always, I will start with a little summary of this review, although this is one of those fantasy series that's just very hard to summarize. And then we'll get into my thoughts and we'll kind of split them up in negatives, then stuff that I really enjoy but where I think that it's not necessarily for everyone, and where, you know, there's certain things about this series that I can see why people DNF the first book or DNF the series. And then lastly we'll go into just the purely positive thoughts where I'm just like, this is genius. And so yeah, let's start with a little summary of the series. As I said, this is a 5-book series, starting with The Ruin of Kings. The 2nd book is The Name of All Things. 3rd, we have The Memory of Souls, then The House of Always, and lastly we have The Discord of Gods. And this series is a kind of chosen one epic fantasy type series. It's kind of really hard to explain, as I just said, what this series really is about, because in a way it's about avoiding the end of the world, but it's also a very character focused series, to the point where in between the big overhanging plot line kind of a lot of times becomes a bit secondary. And so instead of trying to explain to you what the series as a whole is about, I'll just do what I always do and tell you a little bit about book 1, which, as I said, is The Ruin of Kings. In this book we follow our main character, even though I believe in some of the later books he might not even be the POV character who gets the most POV or page time. But we follow our main character Kieran, who is heir to one of the noble houses in this empire that this entire series is set in. And when we meet him at the very beginning of the book, he actually is in quite a predicament because he has been caught and has been imprisoned. And so the setup of this first book is an exchange between Kieran and his jailer, taking turns telling Kieran's life story from the point on when he discovered that he is heir to one of the noble houses of this empire. And so yeah, we have a very unique framing device in this series, because every single book is kind of told as an account of the stuff that happens within the book. But that's already as much as I can tell you pretty much about the series, so now let's move on to my thoughts. And let's move on to the maybe more negative things. And I would say there's really one main negative thing, and that's something that I already had when I read the series the first time around, but that I really noticed when I reread the series, especially the first book, and that is that the series can be very confusing. There is a lot of elements, there's a lot of characters with a lot of names, with a lot of very similar names. And if you watch any of my wrap-ups from last year where I talked about any of the books, most of the time I just said, I don't know what's going on, but I'm enjoying the fuck out of it. And so if you're that type of person, then that's good. If you're the type of person who needs to know everything at every single moment, then this series might be a little bit hard to get through, especially the first book. And that is something that I just noticed on a reread of the first book, that the way the information is presented is not necessarily always done in an ideal way, because a lot of times we are given information that is not necessarily important in the moment or in the scene or even in this first book. And we have a lot of that type of information. So it's not just like one or two tidbits that might be nice to pick up on so that you can then see everything come full circle in later books. No, there's like two main types of information in this book. A lot of it just pertains to the first book and is not gonna be important or not gonna be very important later on. And then we also, as I said, have a lot of information that is important for later books. So yeah, I would say this series maybe isn't necessarily for people who are new to fantasy and new to getting a lot of information in fantasy. And also if you're someone, as I said, who struggles with, you know, gathering information in fantasy books and who does not enjoy not knowing what's going on and having information that's not important in the moment, then maybe the series is not necessarily for you. However, I do also think that this is a problem mainly of the first book, and that Jen Lyons got way better in the way that she presents information in the later books from the second book onwards. And I would say, even though I do really love the first book, I also think that from a technical standpoint, the first book definitely is the weakest one. So I would say continue on. I think actually maybe if you don't enjoy the first book that much but you still want to continue on, you might enjoy the second book more than if you really love the first book, because that's also something that's very specific to the series, that the second book follows a different set of characters from the first book. We do get cameos from characters in the first book, but we kind of have, you know, two separate casts of characters. The first book mainly introduces one set of characters, the second book mainly introduces a second set of characters, and in the third book everything comes together. But actually that's just, you know, a random tidbit. It's not really anything negative. I actually really enjoyed how that was handled. Another thing that I would say veers more towards the negative side, even though I don't care that this is the case in this book, is that if you're someone who wants a lot of descriptions of environment, of clothes, of surroundings, then I also don't think this series is necessarily for you, because there Jen Lyons is very bare bones. She, for example, has a lot of terms for clothing pieces. Does not really describe what those clothing pieces look like though. So yeah, very bare bones descriptions. However, if you're someone who complains about fantasy using too many descriptors and you know, J.R.R. Tolkien spending too long describing the woods or whatever, then this series once again is probably more up your alley. Now onto the things that very much are down to preference, starting with writing and the writing style. I personally love the writing style in this series, because this series does something where it chooses a writing style. It's not a particularly beautiful writing style. Like, this isn't the type of series where I would say the writing is beautiful and the writing is a focus of the book in and of itself, but it's also not one of those series where I would say the writing is simply the tool to tell the story. This is a series where very deliberate writing choices were made, and those writing choices are something that I think a lot of fantasy fans might be upset about, and that is that the writing style and the language used is very modern and very casual. So you don't get a lot of archaic stuff. You get some characters that talk in a more archaic way, but then you also get characters that use "this thing is super hot." So, you know, it's a balance of the two. I really enjoy it because, first of all, I think it really fits the characters in this world. It gives the characters a very strong voice for fantasy characters that distinguishes them from characters in other books. But I also think it gives the series as a whole a very strong voice. By the way, yes, I only do have the thing here because I lent the book to Hannah. I forced her to read it, to start to read it. Anyway, I think it gives the series as a whole a very strong voice. And I just really enjoy it. Like, I love it when authors do something different. And I also think that Jen Lyons is very good in terms of giving her characters voices, because there are a lot of POVs in the series. I mean, luckily in the first book we mainly have 2 POVs-ish. Depends on how you count it. But I won't spoil anything, but you know, you have 2 characters telling the story mostly. One of the POVs in every book is first-person narration, so you have a differentiation there already. But I just think Jen Lyons is very good at giving her characters voices and at distinguishing which character is speaking and which character is telling the story from the way she writes them. And for example, with our main character Kieran, who is the one character who always gets the first-person narration in each book, well, except for the second book. That's the exception, but who mostly gets the first-person narration chapters. I think that Jen Lyons is really good at subtly changing his character voice depending on character development, and it's especially noticeable in the last book. And so I just think, you know, the writing might not be for you because it is very modern, but I also think that she is such a good writer. Let's just put it at that. I absolutely love what she does with her writing. And then also the second thing with writing that either is up your alley or is not up your alley is the footnotes. This is a series that contains footnotes. It's kind of hard to describe the framing device of the series because on the first hand, most of the time you have different characters telling their story, and then you also always have a person who is describing the stories being told and making them into an official account, and that person is always the person adding footnotes. And those footnotes either add things to world building, but a lot of times they're also just snark and just, you know, commenting on stuff in a humorous way. And yeah, I just really enjoyed the footnotes. I am someone, I have to be very honest, I am not a particularly big fan of footnotes. I love the footnotes in here. They are so fun and quirky and just really add, once again, to the voice of the series. I think those were mainly the things that I wanted to say in terms of this can be positive or negative for you. It depends on your preferences. And so now let's get into the purely positive things that are just so much fun. Because, well, let's start with the first thing. First, let's start with what do I want to start with? With the characters. Let's start with the characters because the characters undoubtedly are the best part about this series. I love Kieran, I love Tareth, I love Thurvishar, I love everyone in this series. Also, lastly, about the footnotes, I think I have heard that the footnotes are easier to follow when it comes to audiobooks, and that the footnotes kind of suck in ebook format. Because I did do a read-along of this series the past 5 months on my Discord channel for my book club, which I will leave a link down below. The book club, of course, is all about reading adult high fantasy written by women and genderqueer folks. Even though the read-along is over, you are of course still welcome, if you still want to pick up the series, to join us regardless and to share your thoughts in the channels, because I am sure there will always be people who want to comment on whatever you have to comment on. So yeah, that little plug aside, I think the footnotes, what I heard from other people during the read-along, are good or well done in the audiobooks, but are not that great in the ebooks. And I have heard that in general the audiobooks for these are actually really great. So if you have started the first book and you weren't the biggest fan, maybe try it in an audible version as well. Now back to the characters. I just love all the characters. I mean, I already said that the characters have very distinct voices from each other, so that is really nice. I also really love that all the characters are kind of, well, they're not shitty people, but they have done really horrible things, all of them, either in past lives or present lives. So, you know, there's a lot of moral questioning there, but it's not really done in a way where, you know, the characters are supposed to be redeemed or anything, because redemption isn't really a question in this series. It's just, you know, you love the characters, but they're also not the type of shitty characters that you often get in grimdark books. I mean, they are in terms of what they have done and what they did, but, you know, they don't have the feel of grimdark characters. So yeah, I love the characters so much. Also, I think every single character, or almost every single character, is queer, so there is that. Very enjoyable. The example I always bring is that even the massive, humongous kraken has, like a female massive, humongous kraken, has a girlfriend who is a dragon. So, you know, even the monsters are queer in the series. Aside from that, the relationships are also very well written, very well developed. I really enjoy how complex the relationships are. Like, you have a lot of doubting within relationships, but it's hard to explain, it's hard to go into it without spoilers. Just know that the relationships are so well done, and you can really tell the love that people have for each other, both platonically as well as familiarly, as well as romantically. And also, obviously, this does have polyamory, so there's that, and that is very enjoyable. And yeah, I love the characters, I love the relationships. Kieran is my baby, he is my cinnamon roll. He is so adorable and yet so stupid. He's like, he literally is one of the biggest dumb asses in a, you know, loving way that I have ever read about, because he I don't think he has ever made a good decision in his entire life. But yeah, I just love all the characters. They have depth to them. They are so unique and I absolutely love them. Then also, this is a series that is at once very hopeful but also deals with a lot of dark themes. So there are a lot of trigger warnings for this series. There's trigger warnings for sexual assault. There's trigger warning for mind rape. There are trigger warnings for slavery, for misogyny, for queerphobia, both internalized as well as societal. Homophobia, queerphobia. Our main character, Kieran, very much deals with internalized homophobia from how he grew up, but I think the way it is dealt with is just so well done, because yeah, it's just, I love him. And I also think, even though there are a lot of dark themes in this series, first of all, you know, there's no looking away from those dark themes, and they are kind of confronted head on a lot of the times and also subverted, and they are acknowledged. For example, we have the question of power relations when it comes to sexual assault. Then there's the question of consent that comes up again and again and again. There's trauma. Oh my god, so much trauma. All the characters need therapy, and yeah, it's a lot, but it's all looked at head on and it's not really brushed under the rug or anything. And at the same time, even though there are so many dark contents, and even though all the characters are traumatized as fuck, this series is one of the most hopeful series that I have ever read. And it's just really nice, especially during a time when grimdark is pretty big within fantasy. And, you know, we're not really allowed hopeful series a lot. It's just really nice to have a series where the most central theme, aside from found family, but connected to found family, is pretty much friendship saves the day. And it's just, you know, it's nice. And it's nice in a way where also a lot of characters have, well, all characters kind of have a specific type of plot armor. So it's just nice for once to not worry that characters are gonna die. I mean, you do worry that characters are gonna die, and characters do die, but it's kind of hard to explain without having read the book. But you know, it's not the it's not the constantly fearing for the characters where the emotional punch of the series comes from, but it's truly going into the characters' feelings and looking at their trauma. And that's just something that I really love, because Jen Lyons uses a lot of fantasy tropes and subverts them, like uses a lot of modern fantasy tropes and subverts them, and then also uses fantasy tropes that are sometimes made fun of a little bit, like the power of friendship, and doesn't really subvert them, to be honest, but uses them in just such an expert way where it's just a joy to read. Like, for me, I read the last book in the Greenbone saga at the same time when I read the last book in this series. And for me, something that I have just noticed is that a lot of adult fantasy books have become very exhausting to read because they are so dark, and there's like no ray of hope, and they're so grimdark, and it's just like, I still enjoy them. I loved the Greenbone saga, but at the same time, as I said, it's exhausting to read. I feel like I need a break after I finish the book. And reading this book at the same time, this series refreshed me. This series made me happy, truly happy. And it's just, it's something that we don't get enough of in fantasy anymore, and I absolutely love it. Since we're already at tropes, Jen Lyons somehow used my least favorite trope of all time in her books, which is the resurrection trope. And it worked. It worked in the series, and by the way, it's not a spoiler that she uses the resurrection trope. Like, it's not the type of spoiler where there's one character who gets resurrected, and so saying there's a resurrection trope automatically spoils you for every single death in the series because there's the possibility of resurrection. No, it's not that type of thing, because very early on in this series it is established that resurrection exists within this world, and that one of our main side characters is literally the goddess of death who can bring back people. And so there's resurrection, there's also reincarnation in this series, there's body swapping, there's soul swapping. So many good things that also tend to make things confusing, but that's also just what I meant with Jen Lyons, just takes tropes and subverts them and uses them in really clever ways. Continuing on from that to the world building, I really enjoy, I mean, the magic system is quite basic. You know, the pure magic system is very typical for fantasy. However, I really enjoy what she did with gods and goddesses within this world, and I also love how she included queerness into the world building. I mean, there are societies that are homophobic on the one hand, so trigger warnings for homophobia, as I said, but at the same time it is made very clear that, you know, queerness is something that is completely normal within the series, that exists, and that even exists on multiple levels, where, you know, trans characters exist, where there's whole races of people that spontaneously-ish kind of change their sex, so their physical sex. All of these people are born male, and at some point in their life they just switch to being female. There's different societies with different gender conceptions, and as you know, I love myself a lot of queer world building. I'm not exactly sure, especially when it comes to transgender, if I would call most of what we find in this series transgender rep, since because of the magic system and also because of how the societies work, their concepts of gender and sex are very different from our world, but there's gender queerness going on, and a lot of it, and I love it. I feel like I'm forgetting something that I wanted to talk about, which is kind of annoying me. But yeah, this review is pretty much getting long enough as it is. So the last things I just wanted to say is in terms of the plot. I also really enjoyed the plot. I loved how character focused it is. I love that we kind of, you know, mostly deal with personal drama and family trauma and interpersonal drama. Then also a lot of trauma, working through trauma, and through doing that, the plot is moving forwards, which is just something that I think is very uniquely done and very well done. It's so good. So yeah, I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm probably gonna hate myself for forgetting something that I wanted to say, but overall I can just say that this is one of the most unique series that I have ever read, and I can just highly recommend everyone pick up the series. I'm not necessarily someone who usually, you know, if you don't enjoy a first book in a series, says continue on, but I would say in the case of this series there's such a big jump in the technical improvement that Jen Lyon has from the first to the second book that in this case I would give it the second book to just be aware that the second book follows different characters. I know it's something that kind of put me off the first time I read the series because I was like, I fell in love with all these characters in the first book and now I'm supposed to follow different characters. However, on a reread, I just really started to appreciate the story of the second book and how important it is to the story overall. And yeah, with all of that said, I can really just repeat myself in saying how unique this fantasy series is and how amazing the characters are, and that I would just maybe not recommend it to everyone, but I would still regardless highly recommend it. If you have read the series and you have any thoughts that you want to share, leave them in the comments down below. If you haven't read the series and you want to read the series now, also tell me in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to the book club I mentioned are left linked down below, so go and check those out as well, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!